Hey, GeoTrekkers, this is Dr. Hal. Welcome to GeoTrek podcast number 80, where we're climbing to the roof of the world in the Himalayan mountain range. Our guide, Pete Athans, is a Himalayan mountaineer and a Mount Everest expert. Check out these credentials, y'all. He is a very experienced mountaineer. Pete was the expedition leader for National Geographic's 50 Years on Everest expedition. He also was the winner of the American Alpine Club David Soles Award for Valor and Sacrifice. He was a goodwill ambassador to Nepal and an athlete and ambassador for many years with the North Face. Y'all are really going to enjoy this episode if you enjoy getting out there, excursions, mountain climbing, but also learning about other cultures. We'll hear about the impacts of extreme weather and natural disasters in places like the Himalayas. We know that climate change has been a big deal there as a lot of the glaciers are melting. There's more runoff and flooding in the melt season. And we're also going to talk about the massive earthquake that hit Nepal in April of 2015. If you're new to GeoTrek, we travel the world looking for stories not covered by the mainstream media about extreme weather and natural disasters. We cover the physical processes behind these events, also their impacts on society, and what we can do to get out ahead of these events to mitigate their losses. Y'all, if you're adventurous at all, if you enjoy exploring the world, if you enjoy getting out in the mountains for a climb or a long hike, I think you're really going to enjoy this episode with Pete Athans. Hey everyone, welcome to the GeoTrek podcast. Pete, thank you so much for taking time today to come on the podcast and share your life experiences with us.
Oh, it's been a long time coming to get reacquainted, I think, with you, Hal, and it's really my pleasure and privilege.
Every time we're together, we have amazing conversations that end up traveling the world, and I think it'll be no different today. Pete, I wanted to start off, I know you have this passion and love for mountaineering. I mean, where did that come from? When did you start climbing mountains? And walk us through that journey, please.
I started climbing mountains in my mind back when I was in the 5th or 6th grade. My mom was a social studies and geography teacher and put all the information about, well, the early Everest expeditions, the reconnaissance expeditions that were even trying to just get to the foot of the mountain, let alone climb it. Of course, the tales of Hillary and Tenzing and so many mountaineers during that time frame, which literally was the golden age of mountaineering, and really it was just introduction through books. I grew up in New York, went to high school in New York City, didn't grow up in terribly close to the mountains, but was able to get out into the mountains starting in my early teens, and then moved to Colorado shortly after that, and started traveling throughout the world, beginning in the late 70s. So it's been a real love affair with the high places on Earth.
Oh, for sure. And it seems like you have experience in a lot of these different mountain chains. I wanted to start out with the continental U.S. You've spent a lot of time in the Rockies and the Pacific Northwest. Sometimes we hear about people getting into trouble and needing rescue from places like Mount Hood or Mount Rainier. What are some of the dangers that can blindside people in the Pacific Northwest when they're climbing on some of these volcanic peaks?
Specifically with Mount Rainier, which I know extremely well, Mount Hood a little bit, not quite as well, is that people don't have the appreciation for how quickly the weather can turn, and navigating in whiteout conditions or when there's visibility of, if you feel like you're, we call it being inside of a ping pong ball or something like that, where you have really no appreciation for any landmarks around you, having to travel what most people will know. They use GPS or they'll use map and compass if you're old school like me. But in any case, it's dealing with weather changes and then dealing with a glaciated environment. We just don't have a lot of those. Certainly in the lower 48, in Alaska, we have quite a bit more. And the people who get onto the glaciers of Denali or Mount Hunter or any of the other big peaks up there in the Alaska range certainly know that they're flying into glaciers and that there can be crevasses, there can be other types of hazards as a result of where you're traveling that may be unpredictable. There may be new snow, and those are very similar on Mount Hood and more apropos on Mount Rainier, where we have some of the largest glaciers in the lower 48.
Yeah. So do you feel like sometimes people just get up there and they're maybe underestimating how quickly the weather can change with elevation?
Absolutely. People don't have an appreciation for Mount Rainier specifically, you can go from, bluebird clear skies, no wind, to something completely on the far side of that, where you have extreme wind, very low visibility, driving snow and sleet, very difficult to find your way, even if you can stand up despite the intense winds that you can find up there. So it's a wild environment, and one has to be prepared for it, or certainly be conservative enough to not let oneself get too far overextended.
For the Pacific Northwest, is there a specific climbing season? I'm guessing spring into summer, probably you'd get more climbers up there. Is there a certain time where people tend to get in more trouble than others?
In the Northwest, we have a saying, yeah, the summers are the best time of the year here, but then there are the other 11 and a half months that you got to deal with. Generally, you don't see people going out into the mountains much in winter. I mean, you do see some where there's good access. Of course, skiing is really popular here, and backcountry and alpine. But generally, you're going to see more and more people, and just by virtue of the demographics, you're going to see more people getting in trouble in the fall. And then the summer months, you just see a higher number of people out there pushing it really hard, because the weather during the summer can be quite predictable. So it's very stable to push your limits out there. And so I think we see most of those issues coming up in the spring, summer, and fall, when we see more people out there. This year, guiding on McKinley and also, more importantly, on Mount Rainier, we just saw the climate play a really incredible role. We had to close down the mountaineering guiding on Rainier because of effectively the hot temperatures that made the glaciers just impassable. I mean, we had conditions on Rainier looking more like traveling through the Khumbu Icefall on Everest, where a dozen aluminum extension ladders were needed. And, we've used them over the years there, but this year was particularly different.
Have you seen changes over time in places like Rainier from, say, hotter summers, more melding, things like that?
Absolutely. I mean, we see hotter temperatures. We see, more critically, the freezing point and elevation is and has been for weeks at a time above the summit of the mountain. So effectively what you're seeing is the glaciers and the surface of the glaciers and the terrain doesn't harden, doesn't make it easier for you to travel, doesn't make it safer for the snow bridges one uses to cross crevasses. So it can make the environment quite a bit more dangerous. There are times when at 13,000 feet, you could see water sort of cascading off the top of Seracs, which was incredibly surreal for someone who has been climbing in the mountains now more than 40 years, and being on a glacier where you witness that is quite disturbing.
Pete, I know you're a weather junkie, as a lot of mountaineers are. So let's say someone's climbing Mount Rainier and they want to know what are the conditions up on the mountain. How can they know that? I mean, are there weather stations on the sides of the mountain? Is there anything up closer to the summit? I mean, where would people access data, and how close to the summit can you get those data?
There's actually a really wonderful weather website that's run through the Rainier National Park Service websites, and it'll give you air temperature, pressure, anemometry, maximum minimum temperature, a whole variety of different datum that's really critical to making good decisions up there. So there's so many resources that are through the National Park website.
Oh, that's fantastic. I know, we know if we spend time in the mountains, things can change in a hurry, and having access to those data are super important. Pete, I wanted to travel now to the Himalaya, a place where you spent a lot of time. I mean, could you walk us to that first time when you showed up in that part of the world? I mean, what was it like? What stood out to you about the mountains, about the people? And then walk us through your extensive time there. How long have you spent in that part of the world, and what did your time look like?
As I mentioned earlier, I anticipated being in the Himalaya long before I ever got on a plane, ever got into any place close to the mountains, just through research from the time when I was very young, and then through going through all of the rigorous apprenticeship that I went through in Europe and South America and Denali, all of those places, so that I could be prepared taking on the challenge of the Himalayas successfully and, more importantly, safely. But it wasn't until 1982 that I was able to get to the Himalaya of India. And it was like walking into another world. It was like going into, obviously, a completely new, fresh, untrammeled environment, and also culturally just fascinating and divergent and stimulating and, and uplifting in so many ways.
Oh, that's amazing. So, and it sounds like you spent time obviously climbing there, but along the way, I would imagine, spent time in villages and some of these urban or even smaller village areas, right, in the mountains and in the mountainous valleys.
Absolutely. I mean, climbing was effectively the catalyst that brought me to those places. But as a lot of mountaineers say, the mountains bring us there, but the people keep us coming back time after time after time. And it's really developing those friendships and those relationships, understanding how one can contribute to those communities to be able to deal with not only the good side of tourism, which of course provides revenue and provides jobs for many people there, but also has the downside of culturally diluting some of those practices by effectively having so many Western people traveling into a place like the Everest region. And it has an effect and it has an impact. But I think by contributing our expertise and by contributing our knowledge, we can help to diminish some of those and help to take care of some of the need, some of which is quite profound in these areas.
Well, that's true. I know some of these areas have a lot of needs, maybe have lack of resources or some poverty. So I would imagine the really climbing season and mountain tourism and mountaineering tourism and climbing and things like that does help stimulate the economy, I would imagine, in parts of these mountainous regions of the Himalayas.
It definitely does. I mean, certainly the Everest region primarily, with so many expeditions going, especially in the springtime, more limited in the fall. But there are really quite a few people who not only are going to climb, but there may be people who are going just to trek, to reach the base camps, to see some of the incredible sights of Everest, but so many other peaks that are there. There's I know that there's been just a significant inclusion of people. Just lost you there, but there's so many people who come, especially in the fall season. There are only about 3,000 to 4,000 people who live in the upper Everest region, and there can be upwards of 20 to 25,000 people coming in just the month of October or November alone. So you can imagine that, so many people coming to see that place, to witness the splendor of Everest, but they have to be careful because there's so many people that are on the trails as a result of it. So, trying to work towards spreading out some of the use of that area, and then helping to provide training for the guides who work to bring those people there, so that people can have a safe, wonderful time there, and obviously be able to provide for that need that I mentioned earlier, whether that's for education, whether it's medical, whether it's dental. That there's still that economy in Khumbu that really thrives on tourism, but is sensible.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And that's the thing. I think we're looking for balance, right? Where we bring in opportunities, bring in economic stimulation. But sometimes I've heard of drawbacks if people are too dependent on tourism as well. And I later in the broadcast, we're going to talk a little bit about that. First, I wanted to ask you, I know you've done numerous expeditions to Everest. When you look back at them, are they all very different from each other? In some ways, are they very similar? I mean, how does one expedition stand out to you from another?
Well, each expedition is its own entity. It's its own life is created effectively by the people who are in it, and then the events that take place and the challenges one has to overcome to either get to the top or at least to make a sustained effort and then get everybody back safely. So certainly the landscape we go to is dynamic as well. There's, anything can happen on a huge peak like Mount Everest, where you have these unpredictable elements all around you. There are so many years where we had just significant challenges from the Khumbu icefall and getting up into the western Khum above camps 1 and 2, and then finally the upper mountain. And then obviously just dealing with just the vagaries of dealing with one's own performance at high altitude, which can vary trip to trip, just depending on one's health, conditioning, nutrition. There's so many different variables, it's hard to say that one expedition is exactly the same as another because they're all unique in their own right.
So, Pete, if you went on an expedition in one year and then you went back the next year, would you likely be taking the exact same path, or would parts of the trek be like rerouted because of ice falls or snow or ice conditions?
You would certainly have a general understanding of where a particular climbing route would go, but the actual line, the actual track that's put in, where ropes are fixed, will likely change.
That's interesting. So it sounds like things can change over time. Do things sometimes change dynamically when you're on the mountain? Like that, okay, this wasn't the plan, but we're going to make an alternation because conditions have changed?
Absolutely. I mean, there are times when we have significant ice fall events or big wind events. There can be different types of climactic events that can shape how we approach the mountain and how we try to mitigate some of those dangers.
Also, if really severe winds come in, you could be in a base camp or in a high camp for numerous days. Is that right?
Yes. I've been up at our high camp at 26,000 feet. At one point, I think we were there 5 days before we were able to summit, which was I don't know. I really wouldn't wish that on anybody. Just hearing the wind, wondering whether one was going to be picked up and taken into Tibet against one's will, mind you. I generally believe that we try to limit the amount of time we spend at those high elevations, and sometimes we don't get the opportunity to go when we want to.
So an example like that, where it sounds like that was an extreme example, but multiple people really stuck at 26,000 feet for many days in a row. Are people on oxygen like continuously, or just using it sporadically, or can some people acclimate at certain elevations that even though it's really high, they don't need a lot of oxygen support?
Well, the mountain's been climbed without oxygen. Certainly, people do it, especially people who are Sherpa, do it quite routinely. However, to be able to live for sustained periods of time, it's certainly better for your performance to have it sporadically, and sometimes to have it in a more sustained way for people who are less experienced or don't have the benefit of those superior genetics.
Pete, for you personally, at what elevation do you really start craving more oxygen support?
I think for most people who grow up in the lower 48 and don't spend a lot of time at 6,000, 7,000 meters, I think you really start to notice the difference. Right around 6,000 to 7,000 meters, I think is where you really notice, no matter what your acclimatization is, even if you've been on the mountain for 3 weeks to a month. You definitely notice your performance drops off significantly, and that you start to see the benefits of oxygen really outweigh the detriment of carrying the extra weight of the equipment between 7,000 and 8,000 meters.
Pete, with the oxygen depletion, you mentioned noticing it in your performance. Could you also notice it when you're just trying to rest in your tent? I mean, could you also notice shortness of breath then as well?
Generally, it's one thing I did find is that I could once I was on the mountain 3 to 4 weeks at rest, if I was healthy and acclimatized, I could get my pulse down to a very low rate. I could rest reasonably well, but sleeping was another matter entirely, and that's where oxygen can really help. I mean, you really have just better overall perfusion, better sense of well-being. I think when your body is living in a hypoxic state, even if it's minimally hypoxic, you're kind of always on guard. You're always waiting for something that you may need to do. Your constant state of health and well-being is feeling, I don't know if the word threatened is right, but it just doesn't feel like it's something that's entirely restful enough for you to drop off to sleep. So the oxygen really helps, especially at 7,000 meters and above, to be able to get that needed sleep.
It sounds like the needed sleep, or also if you're exerting yourself, those are the times where oxygen can really be helpful.
Absolutely. Just the restorative ability of a climber on oxygen versus not is quite pronounced. I mean, just your ability to recover from extreme elevation, extreme performance, and exhaustion is really aided and abetted by oxygen, which is, let's face it, just a very strong medicine at high altitude.
Sure. No, it all makes perfect sense. It's just amazing how the body, tries to adapt, and how we've found these ways to come alongside it as well, with science, with oxygen, with things like that. Peter, I want to ask you in general, if a rescue needs to happen in a high mountain area, whether it's the Himalayas, the Andes, the Alaska range, I mean, how does that look? At some point, are you trying to have other climbers carry someone down the mountain? I've heard helicopters can't get up to certain elevations. There's kind of a cap on how high helicopters can come. What does that look like? And where's that cap to where air support kind of is not an option?
Yeah, air support is almost always a second option in a lot of ways. One's more reliant on one's climbing companions to assist with any type of ground support that one needs to get someone down. In recent years, the increasing and I think the improvement in the technology for high mountain flying has really come, and it has arrived in Nepal. We've seen actually a helicopter touch a skid down on the top of Everest. This was I want to say like 2004 or 2005. There was a French team that brought a stripped down version of what they call the B-3 helicopter that was able to do so. They've done rescues and from a variety of places on Everest. They've been able to fly into Camp 2 now routinely. That's at about 22,000 feet. So we start to see helicopters being used more and more on Everest. But on a remote mountain in a different place in poor weather, you're not going to have that type of capability. So you really need to be reliant on your team members. And then obviously if there are other teams on the mountain, they may be approached to assist with the overall evacuation.
Yeah, very interesting. I didn't realize that technology was improving and that helicopters are getting up to higher elevations, but I'd imagine in some situations that could be critical.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly when I first started to go to Everest in the 1980s, we didn't see helicopters going to Everest Base Camp with any type of regularity. I was part of a team that assisted in 1996 doing the highest helicopter evacuation on Everest, which was at about 21,000 feet, and rescued Beck Weathers and Makalu Gao, who were part of the team that were severely affected by the high winds and the difficult climate that we experienced in 1996. But those were the highest elevations that people took helicopters at that time on Everest, and now it's become very routine for people to fly to Everest Base Camp, where there could be 20 flights a day going to the outpost at Everest Base Camp, and there could be similar number of flights going up to Camp 2 at roughly 22,000 feet. And certainly when I started climbing there, that was unthinkable.
That's interesting. So when you were climbing, you'd fly to a lower elevation and have to trek up to those base camps, I'd imagine.
We did. We actually sometimes we took a bus and walked 2 weeks before we got to base camp. So, I mean, that's how long I've been doing this, right? So, in any case, we've seen technology, we've seen the advent of more numbers and better quality helicopters available. We've seen the opening of the airstrip in Lukla by Sir Edmund Hillary and being used quite a bit more. I mean, certainly when I flew in, it wasn't a paved runway. It was just basically it was a cow pasture, and people would run and chase the cows off when the airplanes would come in. And now it's completely paved. There's an actual heliport and of course plane hangar there. So it's completely changed in the last 20 years. So traveling into Khumbu has changed dramatically. But we certainly enjoyed the walking in, got us really acclimatized in those 2 weeks that we traveled to Everest Base Camp. So climbers now generally fly into the village of Lukla at about 9,000 feet and trek in. Some people trek in a lot faster. Some people acclimatize in other places and then fly in all the way to Everest Base Camp. So there are a lot of different types of options that people enjoy because of the I guess the proliferation of helicopters and some fixed wing aircraft as well.
Pete, generally speaking, did people back in the day expect to spend more time on the mountain than they do in the current times?
People would expect to spend away from the States about 3 months. That was the amount of time it took not only to walk to base camp, but at the end of the expedition, walk back out, which could take up to a month in and of itself. Now people will spend maybe as little as 3 to 4 weeks, or much as 6 weeks, but generally not much more than that now. But you had to factor in the extra acclimatization time and the extra approach time, because one would have to travel with all of one's equipment. They would have to be traveling on the backs of either pack animals, or local porters would help us carry that equipment. So that could take several weeks to get to Everest Base Camp, to set up the base camp, and to be ready to go.
Pete, you talked about the benefits to maybe having some focus away from Everest in the region, where obviously the Everest region probably gets some of the highest crowds. What about these other regions in the Himalaya? And I wanted to ask you, are there possibly mountains that have not yet been climbed?
Oh, there are so many peaks that have still not been climbed. I mean, certainly the eastern Himalaya, where we see just a huge proliferation of 6,000 and 7,000 meter peaks. That most of them are unfortunately off limits to Western people. Chinese climbers can go to them. Tibetan climbers can go to them. Certainly along the borders with Bhutan, Bhutanese people do not climb. It's forbidden to climb actually in Bhutan. But there's so many peaks still in the Himalayan chain, the Northern Caucasus. There's still a lot of unexplored terrain out there. Of course, they're not the 8,000 meter peaks left. All of those have been climbed, but there may be some peaks that are very close to 8,000 meter peaks and would probably benefit from a new survey, because some of them are really close enough where they could actually be 8,000ers. So there's still a lot of terrain left to explore for mountaineers who are willing to push it. And if they have the political acumen to get into these places, it's just not the same world that it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when I was doing most of the climbing that I was doing that was more exploratory. So it's just become a more difficult world to travel in. We used to say that, it used to be that the mountains were dangerous and but the countries were always great to go into, and the politics were easier to navigate. And now it's completely different. It can be quite dangerous going into some of the places, certainly in Pakistan and parts of India that are quite dangerous to go to.
So it sounds like in general, some areas may be more restrictive now, or just more unsettled and less safe geopolitically.
Absolutely. There's just there are a lot more challenges, a lot more dangers that one has to factor in, and in the long and short of it, the political dangers are very hard to mitigate.
Yeah, it is. Sometimes it's like, okay, you're one person or you're a small team up against this whole system. So I know that can be challenging. But yeah, that's something when you get out of the States and you start traveling around, it really depends where you are. Pete, you shared a little bit about these advances in aviation with helicopters getting up higher and different kinds of planes. We also know that there have been advances in meteorological sciences in this region with improved modeling and also weather stations where there didn't used to be. Could you share with us a little bit about your help to get a weather station up on the roof of the world?
Absolutely. I mean, we worked with the National Geographic Society and Rolex in putting together five automated weather stations in the Everest region. One which was installed in 2022 that was at about 8830 meters, so very close to the rooftop of the world there, which brings back and telemetrically, via and you can log into it. There's an app with the National Geographic Society which will show you various sources of anemometry, maximum minimum temperature, barometric pressure, albedo or reflected or absorbed light, the difference between the that type of light, and just a variety of different types of datum that make climbing the mountain and understanding them a lot more safe. Chiefly, what mountaineers will be looking for will be the wind speeds. That's the chief issue that we face on a peak like Everest, or really any high mountain. It doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be in the Himalaya. It's really dealing with wind, and if you have any idea of what it's doing near or on the summit of where you're going, and perhaps in a few other spots along the way, you can effectively choose a day. And there's weather modeling now through a variety of different services that can give you an idea of where the actual jet stream is and when it moves off to the north, which typically happens in May and in June. So you're always kind of weighing off the benefits with the mountain. You want to be on the mountain long enough to be able to be acclimatized, but you don't want to be too long to have your performance drop off. And you're trying to converge this jet stream moving to the north with your peaking, with your acclimatization. So it's, you want to hope that you've been on the mountain long enough when that time, that maybe that window opens up in May where the jet stream moves off to the north and you're acclimatized, your camps are set up, your logistics are ready, and effectively your team is ready to move.
So it sounds like there's an optimal window where you're there long enough to acclimatize, long enough to hit the base camps and the high camps and make a run at the summit, but more time on the mountain. I guess it's more time that things can go wrong, and it's also increasing your window then that the jet stream is going to come back down and these violent winds are going to hit you, right? So I'd imagine there's a short window that's optimal.
That's right, Hal. It's really weighing the benefits of the winds that have moved off to the north and are lower, but also the encroaching of the monsoon season, which usually hits sometime in June or early July. But we start to see the effects of the monsoon with significant precipitation that can start really anytime once you get to late May. So it's really trying to thread that needle that includes converging on your own personal acclimatization schedule, and then the winds moving off to the north, and then not having the monsoon encroach from the south. So you're kind of weighing these meteorological events with your physiological events.
No, fascinating, right? It's really this overlap of the world around you plus what's going on with you personally and within your team as well. It seems like a lot of complicated logistics to kind of figure this out and do optimally. And obviously, one year is different from the next. So really interesting challenges that y'all face over there. Pete, I wanted to ask you this. When I worked at the University of Alaska at the Geophysical Institute, I remember writing a press release for the expedition going on Denali to put a weather station up there. And I got to know the team that was doing that. They said, yeah, a lot of times we've done this before. We get a weather station up there at, 19,000 feet. And a lot of times within 4 to 6 weeks, it's blowing off the mountain, or just the winds are so violent up there that it just destroys our best equipment. And it started these conversations about the official strongest wind on earth from Mount Washington, New Hampshire. I always thought that's just like, biblical. That's just like undisputed. And then the conversations with the teams in the Alaska range got me thinking, wait, are the highest winds on earth really from Mount Washington? Or is that just the highest sampled winds we have in places like the Himalaya, the Andes, the Alaska range maybe have much higher winds than that? We just haven't been able to record it. What are your thoughts on that from your time in the Himalaya and establishing this weather station near the roof of the world?
Having started my climbing career on peaks like Mount Washington itself, I've always had incredible respect for that environment. By the same token, you can drive a car very close to the top of Mount Washington. There's a cog railway to the top of Mount Washington. There's a significant weather installation up there. So one might presume that the best recording instruments could be in a place like that. Whereas on a place like Denali and certainly on Sagarmatha or Mount Everest, we rely on, unfortunately, lighter weight, more modular types of engineering equipment. And it's an extreme environment, and you'd have to have more reliable, maybe heavier gauge, more robust instruments. But for Denali and for Everest, you have to carry it up there. You have to be able to carry it up in components because nobody can carry 500 pounds of equipment in a single load. You can't take a helicopter to drop that equipment off, given the weights that would be required to drop there, even in the best conditions. So it's just a challenge of having the recording instruments in the right place and at the right time. We've certainly lost on Everest. Weather stations had them go down, had them lose their telemetry in significant wind events, and some of our scientists are still calculating some of that data that's come back from them. But I think we'll likely see challenges to that Mount Washington record, which is of course just an incredible speed.
Oh, it is. I mean, obviously the winds there in the presidential range and parts of New England, New Hampshire, tremendous wind speeds. Like you're saying, though, they have the benefit of having a road to near the top of the summit. They have a very large observatory. It sounds like you're saying in places like the Himalaya, you don't have those luxuries. You have to pack in lighter weight equipment that maybe is not as durable to handle a 200-mile-an-hour wind.
Absolutely. And, when you're talking about trying to get this equipment to the top of Denali and the top of Everest, there's also the human calculus of risk. And you have, certainly in the case of our expeditions, we had scientists going up there, but largely the equipment was being carried by our Sherpa team. And it was without them, none of that would have been possible. I mean, certainly our scientists were critical in the installation process, but the Sherpas were really essential to getting all of that equipment there at the right time, being there together so that they could do the difficult work of installing the equipment effectively on bedrock. Because if you think you're going to anchor that in snow, that station is going to be gone very, very quickly. I mean, we have to take pneumatic percussion hammers up there to drill holes and to be able to place expansion bolts in those holes to be able to hold everything down and to be able to have effectively this station that has a variety of different sensors on them, whether that's anemometry, variety of different types of temperatures, the albedo that I talked about. All of that equipment effectively hangs on these masts and spars that are all anchored into bedrock, and it takes time to do all of that. So the human calculus and the risk that's involved in doing that is, in an extreme environment like that, is significant.
Pete, you mentioned Sherpa teams and the invaluable services that they provide. So if a Western expedition came in with 10 climbers in general, would every expedition have Sherpas? And what would the ratio be of Western climbers to Sherpas?
There's no really hard, fast and rule on the ratio there. And certainly Western teams have climbed Everest without Sherpa support. That's happened. I don't want to say many times, but it's happened several times throughout the course of Everest history. But generally, you're going to see expeditions going to Mount Everest supported by Nepalese professionals, whether they're Sherpa, whether they're Rai, Tamang, Gurung. There's so many different ethnic groups now that are doing this type of guiding work. It's not only Sherpas. Sherpas certainly held a monopoly on it for many, many years, but in recent years, we're starting to see other Nepalese groups and ethnic groups getting involved with climbing, and they're really quite strong people and have the expertise to be able to do this work. But I think what we see with certainly a scientific expedition like the ones we did with National Geographic and Rolex, we had a ratio of approximately 2 or 3 Sherpa for each climbing scientist. And that's not out of the norm.
Really fascinating there. It sounds like it really depends on the expedition, what you're trying to accomplish, and just a lot of factors come into play there.
Absolutely. The support that you need is, certainly we just needed a lot of support because we had so much equipment that had to be transferred on a daily basis up the mountain. I mean, people understand that when you're climbing a mountain like Everest, first you're climbing a logistical mountain. You have to have all your supplies all the way up to your top camp, and you build on that camp during the course of the 3 to 4 weeks that you're there before you summit. So you have the logistical mountain, you have the physical mountain. It takes the money to be able to get all the equipment, get all the people there, and make all that happen. So you have the logistical, the physical, and then finally you have the physical summit. That if you're lucky with the climate, if you're lucky with your acclimatization, everything works according to your plan, you get a shot.
It sounds like a lot of different factors overlapping. And like you said, some of the things are in your control, but a lot of them are outside your control as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you just try to work with the efficiency that you have, with the team that you have, and obviously every year you have a constantly changing mountain, you have a constantly changing climate, and you have to just try to be as prepared as you can for it, and also have I think, a conservative approach, have the humility to be able to withdraw if it's just not going to work and not going to be safe.
No, for sure. Fascinating. And, it's really interesting to talk to you because of all your years of experience, the different expeditions you've done. And it sounds like you've been there in different capacities as well. Pete, I first met you with your wife, Liesl. You both came to coastal Texas to film a documentary following Hurricane Harvey. And I know you all have a huge heart to get out there and interact and be a blessing to people that have been affected by catastrophes. I have to ask you, I mean, with all your experience in Nepal and the Himalaya, obviously, there was that devastating, catastrophic earthquake in April of 2015. What was that like for you to see that? And then what were the big impacts of that earthquake?
The earthquake that hit Nepal, not only on the first shock, but the second one that came weeks later, it was devastating for the entire country. Remarkable that during the spring, I know it happened in April, I believe, and there were significant numbers of people on the mountain, and the Nepalese did an incredible job of evacuating people out of camps 1 and 2, largely with the support of the helicopters we've been talking about. But if you weren't on Mount Everest, you may not have seen that type of outreach and that type of support going into some of the more remote parts of the country. So there were significant groups that were going into various parts of the Himalaya to try to help people who were just digging out of there, and then trying to bring in new types of building technologies to be able to rebuild in some places where they had a significant earthquake event 40, 50 years earlier that took place that destroyed a good number of significant infrastructure in the Kathmandu area, and then obviously outside of the capital city as well. Earthquakes are nothing new to the people of Nepal, but it's unfortunately a lot of the building that's gone on there is it's not to a type of standard. I mean, very few places have that type of standard that can withstand those 8 Richter scale and higher types of earthquakes. So it's devastating to the population.
Pete, do you think there's the capability and the resources to build back stronger and more earthquake resistant, or are some of these areas just don't have those resources? They just don't have that wealth to do that.
Some of the places certainly don't have those types of resources. They have very minimal resources to begin with, but we are seeing people making significant contributions towards new types of technology using old school materials. Like one of the things that we noticed when we did a film with Nova on the earthquakes that took place there, our expeditions focused on why did certain types of architecture survive and why some didn't. And some of the newer architecture failed, whereas some of the old architecture survived and continues to survive in this day. And one thing that we learned with some of the UNESCO sites and some of the ancient temples that are in the Kathmandu Valley is that they had significant types of mud and brickwork, but it was interspersed every meter with a layer of wood, which brought a type of dynamic resilience and ability to absorb the earthquake shocks better than the materials that were just poured concrete or were mud or adobe. So some of the ancient construction actually was more resilient and more durable than the newer types of construction.
Oh, that's fascinating. We've seen that in other places, like in hurricane country. Sometimes people say, this house is 100 years old, but it has cypress siding that was, very resilient materials to start with. It sounds like you're saying in the Himalaya there are some of these practices to mix building materials, like maybe mud, stone, and wood, maybe perform better in some cases than just poured concrete or something that didn't have as many different materials.
Absolutely. That's one of the conclusions that we reached. But again, it may also just be the location of that particular temple or that particular structure. We don't know specifically, but it led to some very interesting research during the course of our time there.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Always really interesting to see how building better can help you withstand these disasters. We can't necessarily stop the disasters, but if we can maybe build better, there may be some things we can do to mitigate their losses. Pete, I wanted to ask you as well, several years after the earthquake, COVID-19 happened. We know in parts of the Himalaya and other mountainous regions of the world, there's a large economy based on tourism and on mountaineering. How did COVID impact these mountain areas, and how did the people overcome that?
It was COVID was devastating for a country, not only just a region of the Himalaya, but a country that relies very strongly on tourism as a chief driver of its economy. The country effectively shut down for a period of about 18 months. I mean, there was some testing. Vaccines were very slow to come to Nepal, both from China and from India, but they did become available, a year or more into the actual pandemic. The Everest expeditions were canceled initially. They started to open back up again in 2021. I know that I went there in 2019 to do our big expedition with the Geographic and Rolex, and we had planned to go back the next year in 2020 and 2021, and we had to cancel because of the pandemic. We were able to go back in 2022. There were certainly still plenty of incidents of COVID in the area. I mean, people were being evacuated from the Everest region and other parts of Nepal because of COVID, but the country was starting to open up again, even prior to 2022 spring. But you did not see the numbers of people coming back as there had been until we reached 2022, and then obviously we have I don't want to say the repressed energy of having a couple of years off come back to Everest, and now in the last couple of years we've seen even greater numbers of people coming back to the mountain. But during the pandemic, it was a very difficult time for people who rely on that income to, whether that's in trekking lodges or whether that's a Nepali porter who relies on that income for his family and his family farm, or whether that's a climbing Sherpa, or whether that's another professional who works in the trekking industry, a business owner in Kathmandu, a hotel owner in Kathmandu. All of those people were severely affected by the lack of tourist revenue.
Pete, I heard within the climbing community, some fundraisers happen for climbers to raise money and send that over to Nepal and places like that. I wasn't surprised to hear that. I know the climbing community often comes together as a family. I mean, I'd imagine that you heard of some of these things, and it must have been very moving.
Absolutely. I mean, between, the large foundations like the American Himalayan Foundation in San Francisco to, small family-run foundation, the Khumbu Climbing School, Alex Lowe Charitable Foundation, all these very small philanthropic organizations were doing fundraisers, selling T-shirts, brownies. The American Himalayan Foundation was not selling brownies. We were selling brownies, but anyway, we were just trying to get money into the hands of people who didn't have trekking work and who were just kind of living hand to mouth on their own saved resources. When you lose a couple of Everest seasons and a good climbing Sherpa who will make $8,000 to $10,000 per season, they rely on that income, and without having it, they get into a subsistence mode where no one could travel during the pandemic. You couldn't go to another place and get a different job. You really were just stuck. So many different philanthropic organizations got involved, but as importantly, just the community themselves stepped up and helped one another. And that's, I think, one of the enduring lessons that I've learned in traveling there is the communities step up and help one another. They work together to try to make sure that, the old people in the villages are taken care of. The young kids are still getting an education, that people are still having enough food to put on the table. It might be really meager, but the people just pull together in a way it's remarkable and very heartwarming to see.
No, very encouraging. And these are the examples, with COVID, obviously it was such a catastrophe. And hearing these types of examples, I think, really inspired a lot of people like, wait, if they're looking out for each other, maybe we can do the same wherever people were located. Pete, before we wrap up the podcast, I wanted to ask you, when I met you and Liesl, you guys were down here, you do filmmaking, making documentaries, often documenting how people have overcome natural disasters and catastrophes. I know Liesl is very involved with the Buy Nothing project, where people can actually give to people that have been impacted by a disaster, where those disaster-stricken people don't have to buy new goods. Could you just share a little bit about that work that you two have done going into disaster zones and not only documenting it, but helping people out that were impacted?
Absolutely. I mean, Hal, when we met, we were going through various parts of Texas to look at the devastating effects of what Hurricane Harvey did that year, and we were just moved by how gracious people were and how incredibly giving people were to try to assist the people who had been, had their homes flooded, were living outside. I mean, we had no ability to travel. When we saw people coming from West Texas, from Louisiana, from a variety of different places. I mean, the efforts of the Cajun Navy were really well documented. What was less well documented was just how so many different people from different backgrounds came together, from different political stripes, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, but people were there to help, whether it was getting someone to a doctor's appointment or bringing somebody their prescriptions or shopping for groceries. This was happening on a micro level. And Liesl's efforts with the Buy Nothing project is to try to encourage the same type of community, the same type of sharing ethic, to be able to, effectively try to essentialize what people's needs are, how we have a real abundance amongst people, although we may not always see it, and to try to recognize that everyone can have something to share. If they want to learn more about the Buy Nothing project, certainly we have an app available through the Apple Store, the website. Buy Nothing, you can check everything out there. But Buy Nothing also does a variety of different disaster types of drives when there are those issues taking place throughout the world. We had a significant outreach during the earthquake period that brought materials to Nepal at that time. So we had an earthquake relief sort of sub-site within the Buy Nothing website. So we just find that where there are people in need, there are people willing to step up, which is why I'm still encouraged, despite the issues we have. And it seems like we do see a lot of conflict in the world today. I mean, what's going on, obviously, in the Middle East right now is terrible, but we also see that there are people willing to step up and there are people willing to help. So I'm always encouraged by that. And Liesl and I want to try to harness that and try to, through our efforts, make that easier and more efficient for people if and when we can.
Yeah, Pete, like you said, there's a lot of problems in the world, but I think the work you and Liesl and your team are doing it's very inspirational, right? It's giving people an opportunity to reach out, get to that disaster zone, that war-stricken zone, and actually help people out. And like you said, you don't have to have tons of resources or tons of money to make a difference. Things like the Buy Nothing project, you're connected with someone on the inside that really just needs sometimes basic living supplies. So really encouraging and inspirational. Here with GeoTrek, we're always trying to share these stories that are not covered by the mainstream media. And we see sometimes that the mainstream media comes in, they want to be there for 2 days when the disaster hits, and then they're gone. And it's like, wait, there's so much good stuff happening sometimes in disaster zones with groups like yours coming in and helping folks out. So thanks for all the hard work you're doing. And thanks again today for taking time to come on the podcast. It was fun to travel with you from the Pacific Northwest to the Himalaya to Texas after Hurricane Harvey. We covered a lot of ground, and I think our listeners will be very inspired.
Thanks so much, Hal. I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak with you and obviously your community, and wish everybody well. And I hope I can come back soon.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate you taking time to come on the podcast.
All right. Take care, Hal. Bye for now.
Pete, thank you so much for taking time to come on the GeoTrek podcast. What an adventure we took today, talking about what it's like to do mountaineering, both stateside and overseas. We talked a lot about the Himalaya and advances in weather stations and weather prediction at some of the highest altitudes on Earth. We talked about what it's like to live and function and perform at these high elevations, the role of oxygen, and how people can get trapped in these base camps or these high altitude camps with ground blizzards for a day at a time. I thought it was really interesting to talk as well about advances in aviation, that helicopters and planes are now able to get up higher into these mountains and service the climbing community, also help with rescues as well. I think the topic that we touched on, though, that most embodies the heart and soul of GeoTrek is where you shared that some of the historic structures in the Himalaya area actually weathered the 2015 earthquake better than some of the newer structures. You talked about how building with stone, mud, and wood was actually better in some locations than just building with one or two materials. That really embodies the heart and soul of GeoTrek. We like to get out there and do adventures. We like to explore the world. We really love to know what are the impacts of extreme weather and natural disasters on the built environment, on people's lives, and what can we do to get out ahead of these disasters to mitigate their losses. I thought it was really interesting what you shared there about the building practices and this insight that sometimes the older buildings perform better than newer buildings. That's not isolated to the Himalaya. We've heard similar things along the Gulf Coast of the US and hurricane country and other places in the world where sometimes actually the older building styles, methods, and materials outperform newer construction. That's something really interesting to take from this podcast and to apply to our lives. Pete, thank you so much again for taking time to come on the podcast. Thank you to our listeners who are adventurous, who like exploring the world. We can't always hop on a plane and travel the world every day, but you can always tune into the GeoTrek podcast and hear our guests like Pete Athans, who have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort and developed this expertise in an exotic region of the world. Everyone, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the GeoTrek podcast.